Yes, we're live.
All right, come take a seat, cameraman. Thanks everyone for coming to attend how you can increase your blog subscription model and subscription rate by over 200% with the help of Facebook ads. And that was very much me reading the exact title, but essentially what we're really going to talk about, let me go ahead and pull that up for you. What we're really going to talk about is how to build a successful blog subscription model and how you can use Facebook ads to support a successful blog subscription model. You know, what benefit can it bring you? So the first thing we wanted to do is show you some stats to kind of just back up the reasoning behind that reason why. The first is that marketers who prioritize blogging are 13 times more likely to achieve a positive ROI on their blogging efforts. The next is, let me move the mouse for you real quick. The next is that companies that publish 16 or more blogs in a month saw a 4.5 times more leads than companies who only blog 0 to 4 times in a month. For small businesses that blog, the ones that do get 126% more lead growth than small businesses who do not. And of course, when it comes to the consumer, really the point of a newsletter subscription is to gauge interest. You know, get people who are in that industry or in that specific topic interested in what you're writing about and get them engaged with your brand. 68% of consumers are likely to spend time reading content of a brand or newsletter that they're actually interested in. So again, that's kind of the point of a newsletter, is to get people interested in your brand and what you're talking about. And so we're going to show you how to do this in 5 steps. The first of which is developing a content strategy, writing and publishing, setting up the distribution channel and sign-up channels, setting up the actual newsletter, so the product itself, and of course, my favorite part, measuring and optimizing. And if you have any questions, definitely raise your hand, let me know, and if I'm going too fast or anything, let me know too. So the first step is developing a content strategy. And in order to do that, you really need to understand who are you writing for. So the first thing to do is set up a persona. And a great starting point is to first understand who are they following. So who are they currently listening to? What influencers are they following on social media? What publications are they reading? This really gives you a chance to kind of get a good understanding of the tone and language that they use and the different topics in which, you know, that they like to read about. The next thing to do is to hear what they're talking about. So not just what they're reading or who they're following, but what they're saying themselves. A great way to do this is to go and Google and find an industry phrase that's specific to what your brand offers and just put the word forum afterwards. You'll be surprised how many actual forums there are related to your industry or a lot of different industries, and you can see from the horse's mouth, you could say, exactly what they're saying as far as their needs, pain points, desires, and goals. This is probably one of the most effective ways to get topics that are most relevant to what your personas are really interested in. And speaking of what they're interested in, you also want to pay attention to what triggers that specific topics or pieces of content your consumers have. So anything that makes them take action, you know, is something you want to pay attention to. So a great way to do this is to go through your competitors' blogs and social media channels and look at what types of posts or information or topics get the most engagement, shares, likes, comments. That'll help you get a gauge on what types of information or topics you can talk about that actually triggers them either emotionally or triggers them to take some type of action. And so once you've put all of this research together, the final step of the content strategy is to actually create a list of topics. And when you're putting this list of topics together, it's really important to make sure that you're not only adding value from what you've already discovered, but you're communicating things from the angle that would most fit the morals or values or goals that the user you've been researching has. So you want to create a good list, maybe 10 to 20. That way you have a good database to start from when you start writing, which is exactly what you do next. You want to at least have 4 or 5 different blogs on your actual blog before you start to promote it. You know, the reason for this is, I mean, I'm sure you guys have ever been to a blog and then you see like, there's like 1 or 2 blogs on the whole thing, and it kind of like loses its authority, you know, like it's just reputation-wise, it doesn't fit very well. So you want to make sure you have at least 4 or 5 on the blog before you start trying to get people to go to it. And of course, when you're writing this, definitely make sure you're adding value from what you've read about before. So what your competitors are talking about, make sure that you're not only touching on what they're talking about, but taking it to the next level. How can you add value more so than what's already available out there? And so the next step is to set up your distribution and sign-up channels. And there's on-site channels and off-site channels. Specifically for signing up, on-site you have call-outs and forums, and off-site, that's more of a distribution channel. You can use Facebook and email. Facebook is kind of a jack of all trades because it's also a really effective sign-up channel, and we'll talk a little bit more about how so in a little bit. The client that we're going to be showcasing for the case study today is Highland Precision Ag. They're an agricultural technology provider, and their ideal personas are farmers. So their goal, since they were a new company, you know, they're trying to establish a brand presence. They wanted to become a thought leader in the industry. So from a strategy standpoint, what better way to do that but than to set up a newsletter following? So here's some examples of Highland's webpage and where the callouts and forms would be. So on the actual website itself, on the footer, you'll see this a lot with newsletter signups and forms, is that we'll put it in the footer and just ask for that email. And then an example of a call out, just to kind of give you a visual, would be, you know, if you scroll a certain amount down the screen and then something kind of slides up asking you to subscribe. So call outs are a little more dynamic, while forms usually are a little more static. And so there's 3 questions you want to ask yourself when you're developing these call outs. The first of which is, how many fields? Now, when you're signing up, or when your user is signing up for a newsletter, it's a much bigger commitment than if they're just signing up for like an ebook or some type of one-off piece of content. You're giving them, or they're giving you permission to be in their inbox on a frequent matter. So it's much more personal than just having one piece of content. And so because of that, the commitment that they're giving you is more valuable is valuable enough that you want to minimize the amount of friction. In other words, minimize the amount of fields. So we would definitely suggest, if you're going to set up a newsletter subscription, only ask for their email. And the next question is, where are you asking? It might be appropriate to ask on the blog listing or on other blogs as well, but it is definitely not appropriate to ask for a newsletter sign up, especially like a call out, if they're on the contact us page or something like that. So you want to be very aware of where you're asking for it and not just put the call outs all over the site everywhere. And of course you want to think about how you're asking them. You know, you want to make sure that you're using language that matches the persona that you've created. And you want to use language that's also very direct, so they understand the value they're getting by signing up, and that they're clearly understanding what they're signing up for, which would be a subscription newsletter. So we're going to look at an example, and I want you guys to give me kind of your input on the good and bad about this example. All right, so before we start to get some feedback, the first question is, and I'm disrupt the whole experience that you're having. On top of that, I have no idea what I'm signing up for, and you're being kind of aggressive, and I don't like that. So if I try to get out of here, and I know everyone here has experienced the same thing as well.
So frustrating.
There it is. Can you, and especially when it's mobile, like
you're not going to. Fleck on the screen.
Yeah, exactly.
Like an egg.
And this happens way too often. People think that this is a good thing because you don't have a choice but to sign up, but no, we're going to hit the X on the top here and get out of the whole site if we come across that again. So here's the example, which we kind of already looked at, of a little more polite approach to asking someone to subscribe. So again, this is that callout that we used. You can see immediately, you know exactly what you're getting, even at a glance, without actually reading what it is. On top of that, we have some social proof and what they're actually getting in the content of their newsletter if they sign up. So right now we're just, and of course, easy access to saying, never mind, not now. So we'll come back to him later.
Where are you using that? Is that as an exit?
So that is being used when you scroll halfway down the page on their on the newsletter, or not on the newsletter, on the blog itself. You can also set it up for like if they've been on for 7 seconds, or they scroll 3/4 down the page, or they've been on a certain amount of pages and now they're ready to show. So the next part is to set up your Facebook ads. And really, Facebook ads, like I mentioned, is the jack of all trades. And you can use it for the distribution, the getting people to sign up, so that whole process as well. And from a user standpoint, the way that people are using Facebook these days is that it's a huge consumption channel for content, especially with blogs and articles and different types of formatted content. And of course, my favorite part is the targeting. So here's an example of what we use for Highland, and these are some of the different elements you really want to pay attention to when you're crafting your Facebook ad. The first of which is the headline. Now the headline usually is the same as whatever you title your article, but we find it very valuable because we get a great opportunity here to test different headlines or blog titles that we might have wanted to use instead. So this helps us for this specific article if we want to change the title after we discover, it's kind of like the 1-2 jab to get them to engage with the post or at least click on the article and take a look at it. And of course the image. The image is like the first thing people look at. Maybe not consciously, but it's the thing that catches their eye. If you're scrolling through Facebook, you see a post with just text, you're probably going to keep scrolling. The image is what really gets their attention. Usually you want to use something that is familiar to them. We would probably suggest using either a picture of a person that is someone who is like your persona or someone who your persona strives to be like, someone they admire. If you're not, then you want to use any type of element that is part of their daily routine, but of course you want to do it in a very impactful way that doesn't look like a stock photo. It looks very custom to the people you're targeting. And I threw this in here, the CTA versus no CTA. Kind of wanted to show how many specific elements you can manipulate within Facebook ads. We actually found that using the CTA gets a lower click rate than not using the CTA. Using the CTA does get a lower click rate than not using it in a lot of cases. And so we tried to figure out why that was happening. And we discovered apparently when you're on mobile looking at these, at these articles and ads, if you have the CTA, it actually cuts off some of the headline. If you don't have the CTA, you can read the whole headline. So Facebook will tell you using the CTA works better, but definitely don't always take what Facebook tells you at 100%. You want to test it and find out for yourself because every persona is different. And so you might find yourself with like 30 or 40 different variations of a single ad for an article you have, and that's okay. In fact, that's a good thing. Because the point of testing all these variations, especially in the beginning, is to find that sweet spot. What type of imagery, headline, copy works with your audience and getting their attention. And that kind of takes us over to targeting. In the beginning, you definitely want to cast a really wide net. You want to get as much engagement and traffic to your site as possible. If you did a good job in your content strategy phase, then the topic that you're writing about will get relevant enough traffic. So people that are finding the information you're talking about valuable, interesting, or entertaining. Yes.
What's the frequency in which you would test each of those variations?
So when you say frequency, you mean like how long you would test it before?
Or I guess a better question is, how often would you change between your variations? Like from the last slide, all of those ones listed there.
So what happens? Targeting, and I mentioned casting that wide net. You know, that's really important in the beginning because what you're doing is you're collecting data and you're also learning more about your users and how they interact with your content. You're learning more about your content as well. So at this point, that's when you might see a bunch of, once you hit that sweet spot with the ad itself, you might see the traffic go up. And this is actual data that we use for Highland Precision Ag. And we'll be revisiting this specific graph in a little bit. But also keep in mind, just because an ad performs really well, doesn't mean, the whole point of this, doesn't mean that your subscriptions are going to find more success at the same time, which is what happened here. So even though one of our posts went viral, it had a very minimal effect in the actual subscription rate. So what we learned is that, okay, the elements we used in the ad itself were great, knocked it out of the park. But the on-page call-outs, the blog, weren't really having a strong effect of getting people to sign up. So we had a couple steps here as far as what we learned and different actions that we took. And you can see here we had a good increase, and then we had a really big increase here. So, and it's interesting enough seeing as the traffic goes down, the amount of people subscribing went up. And we're gonna explain how we did that in a little bit. When it comes to the distribution of the actual product, which is the newsletter, you want to pay very special attention to the frequency. So how often are you sending these newsletters out? The number one reason, they did a study of all US consumers, well not all, but as many as they could get. And the number one reason people unsubscribed from any emails was because of the frequency. They were seeing it too often in their inbox. I mentioned before, it's a very intimate commitment they're making because your emails, sometimes there's a lot of spam, you can filter that out, but when they're willingly telling you, yes, you can send me emails that are going to be in my face, in a periodic times, you have to be very sensitive to that. So, you don't want to put them through this where they're happy and then they just lose their mind. The next thing you want to pay attention to is your subject line. Now this is more commonly known, but specifically we wanted to just touch on what devices are they using. Are they going to see that full subject line or are they just going to get the incomplete story? Similar to what we were talking about with the CTAs. If you have the CTA, you don't see the whole headline. If you use a subject line that's too long, most people on their mobile aren't going to see it. So you can see I just pulled up randomly whatever was in my inbox. And 3 of the 4 on top there can't even read the whole thing. This is the only one on the bottom. John Loomer gets it. Free webinar today. So just think, yeah. So definitely keep in mind different devices that your user might be using. And it's fun to test subject lines like using emojis or not, personalizing it if you get their first name, and things like that. And then of course the content of the email you're sending. Again, same thing. Pay special attention to how your user is used to consuming content. It might be a completely different format from what we're looking at here. The reason we have this laid out the way it is because we're catering to the farmers. We're using plain text email with as little HTML as possible, only showing images in relevant places to help gauge interest in whatever that article is talking about, and of course a real signature with an image of a person sending you an email as opposed to a brand or company. And this might not work with other people, but we found this to be most effective with farmers. So when you're creating your content on your actual email, there are best practices that apply to everyone. You don't want to have too much of a description up there. You want to let them get to the meat and the point of the email, which is the actual articles that you're talking about. When you're listing your articles, using imagery makes it so much more easy for them to understand what the article is about, and it also gives them a reason to continue to scroll, because imagery is a lot more attractive to the human eye than text is. And so now my favorite part, measuring and optimizing. You've created the newsletter, you've distributed all the content, and you've gotten enough data, so now you can start to assess and see what you can do better. So the first thing you want to look at when you're measuring and optimizing is the blog itself. That's the product in which essentially they're signing up for, is reading these blogs. It's very important not to use just one of these measurements or metrics as your, okay, that's a successful blog, as your KPI, you could say. You might get a ton of views, just like the one we saw before with the first ad, but that doesn't translate to a successful blog. So you want to pay attention to everything else. The views only tells you that your headline and topic were interesting, and your image that you're promoting with it were very interesting. When you get deeper into these metrics, that's when you know if that blog was successful. Some things you want to look at: on-page subscribers, people who entered through that article and ended up subscribing within the same session, so first entry subscribers. And then you have heat maps and click maps like we're looking at here. Time on page, click-through rate, bounce rate, and comments. So these are all metrics that are directly related to the engagement that people are having on your blog, especially knowing that they're scrolling and actually scrolling to the end of it, and then correlating that with the time on page to confirm, okay, people are actually reading this one, it's good. And then if you see a good amount of clicks going on, that means what you're writing about is relevant enough that after they finish, they still want more. So that's an even better metric to be paying attention to. And then another fun one to measure and optimize is your callouts. So that's this guy right here. I invited him back to help us demonstrate how we can optimize these callouts. But before we can do that, we have to understand, how do we know if it's successful? The first thing is obviously subscription rate. So your website's full subscription rate, how's it doing? That does give you an idea of how your callout is doing. Callout success rate is, callout success rate is, of all the people who saw this specific callout, how many subscribed? So it's a little more for you to see maybe you could be better. The next thing you want to measure and optimize are your emails. So these are the different metrics you want to pay attention to when you're looking at the success of your emails. Obviously, it's very similar to the blog. Open rate does not equal successful email. It means successful subject line. These are the other metrics you want to look at, especially click rate. So open rate, good. Your subject line did great. Then you start to look at your click rate and scroll percentage, click heat maps even. That's when you know it's really successful. You definitely want to pay attention to your spam, or reported as spam metrics, because if people are doing that to the emails that you sent that they willingly signed up for, you're doing something very wrong. And it's probably frequency, to be honest. So you want to pay very special attention to the negative metrics as well, so you know where my problem area is. And then of course the Facebook ads. So when you're measuring and optimizing these, of course the very first metric you want to look at are the engagement metrics. So these are likes, shares, comments, any type of engagement that they're doing on the actual ad itself. And then link clicks, which is really what you want them to do, is when they click on it and they actually go to the site. Results rate is essentially the click-through rate. The relevancy score and the positive and negative feedback are two things that Facebook, it's their custom measurement metrics. And if you're close to anything like 7 to 10 on the relevancy score, you're doing a really good job. Anything less, you want to maybe revisit either your targeting or your topic. And then positive and negative feedback is very straightforward. If you have positive reactions and engagement, that's good. If you have negative, which is when people click to hide your post, that's bad. And so now we're going to get a little more specific into the case study itself on how we reach each of these successes here. And we're going to start by looking at how we got that traffic up. And we did touch on this a lot, so I'll be brief, but I also want to kind of reiterate what I was talking about earlier, which means just because some of your metrics are performing wildly well doesn't mean that it's a completely successful blog. So what we have here, within the time period that this was showing, we had 19,000 clicks, almost 350,000 people reach, and 23,600 engagements on the actual post. Now, one thing we want to pay special attention to on this specifically is the big difference between people who actually read, or at least attempted to read the article, versus people who engage with the post. And you can see there's 217 comments, which tells us that something we kind of already knew is that people will read a headline, see a picture, and react. So this is pretty much telling us this is the right thing to do as far as the elements and tactics we use if we want to get engagement and we want to get a lot of clicks. But what we did on the actual article was not indicative of a successful blog. And these are the metrics that prove that. On the blog itself, not just the ad, it had 23,000 visits and only 103 subscribers. So the subscriber rate there at 0.45% it's pretty low considering the opportunity we had with 23,000 visits. But again, it helped us understand what works on the ad itself as far as the topic, headline, and imagery. The next step we had after we gathered enough data is how do we get this first peek here on getting more subscribers on the page? So this is where we had enough data that we could measure and optimize what we were looking at. So like I mentioned before, we actually did test the color of the call out, and originally it was green, and then we changed it over to orange. So the reason why the orange outperformed the green, there's a lot of assumptions we can make. It could be that the green kind of blended in with the rest of the site. The contrast on the green wasn't as easy to see as the contrast on the orange, but we know that this worked better. And then there was a second element that we could safely assume attributed to the success of that second peak, which was this article. Now this kind of came in as a result of measuring and optimizing our blog. We realized, okay, not a lot of people are subscribing, let's try some new things. This blog was more so focused on delivering value to the farmer. What takeaways could they get from this article? And so at the end we provided, I think it was 8 to 10 different ways they could sell their produce besides the ad itself did 5,700 post engagement. It's actually a good thing when you can see a closer